My husband believed having a baby could save our marriage, but while secretly falling for another woman, I decided to leave and file for divorce. When I married James, I believed that we were a team, two people who would weather life's storms together. We had been best friends before anything else, and we always promised each other that we would work through anything, no matter how difficult. But over time, things began to shift. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the small, subtle changes that were impossible to ignore. The lingering silence during dinners, the long nights when he stayed late at work, and the growing distance between us. At first, I told myself it was just a rough patch, a busy season in his career, or maybe I was just overthinking. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I had been married to James long enough to sense the tension in the air, even if he hadn't said a word about it. There were no big arguments, no falling out. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at me, something that wasn't there before. It was like I was a stranger to him, someone he didn't recognize. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the more I tried to reach him, the more he pulled away. I spent long nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was just me, if I had somehow changed, or if the man I married was no longer the same person I thought he was. Then, one evening, after another quiet dinner, he said something that caught me off guard. "Maybe we should have a baby. It might bring us closer." The words lingered in the air, and I could feel my heart sink. He said it with a certain finality, like he believed it was the solution to everything. But there was something about his tone that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't excitement or joy, it was desperation. A kind of urgent hope that seemed misplaced. I put my fork down slowly, studying his face. I had always known that having a child was a huge responsibility, something that required deep, unconditional love, not an attempt to patch up a broken relationship. "James, do you really think a baby will solve this?" I asked carefully, trying to mask the unease in my voice. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for an answer. But all I saw was uncertainty. "I think it's what we need," he said quietly. "We'll be a family again. Everything will be better." But his words felt empty. I wasn't sure if he was trying to convince me, or if he was trying to convince himself. I knew James well enough to recognize when he was masking his true emotions. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't the one he was trying to reach out to. For the first time in our relationship, I felt completely alone. The idea of a child, a future that should have been filled with love, hope, and excitement, now felt like a heavy burden. It was as though he had chosen this path because he didn't know what else to do. Maybe a child would fill the void in his heart, or maybe it would give him the distraction he so desperately needed from the reality of our marriage. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that a child wasn't the answer. I wanted a family, of course, but I wanted it to be built on love, trust, and mutual desire, not as a means to salvage something that felt already lost. In the days that followed that dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about James's words. The idea of having a child to fix our marriage kept echoing in my mind, but no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was a good idea, my gut kept telling me otherwise. I watched him over the next few weeks, trying to understand the man I thought I knew so well. The more I observed, the more I saw how distant he had become. His usual warmth was gone, replaced by a coldness that I couldn't explain. He was there physically, but emotionally, it felt like he had checked out a long time ago. His work schedule was becoming even more unpredictable. Late nights at the office, weekends spent on calls, and when he was home, he was distracted, his mind seemingly elsewhere. I found myself in the same house as him, yet we were worlds apart. The small gestures of affection that used to define our relationship, holding hands, sharing quiet moments, had vanished. It was as if he was afraid to touch me, afraid to let me in. I tried to confront him about it, hoping he would open up. I needed him to talk to me, to tell me what was going on, what had changed between us. But every time I tried, he would brush me off with a vague excuse, a half-hearted apology, or a promise to talk later. I became frustrated, confused. How could a man who once promised to be there for me through thick and thin suddenly become so unreachable? Then, one evening, things took an even stranger turn. I had just returned home from a late meeting with a friend, hoping to have a quiet night with James. But when I walked in, I found him sitting on the couch, his phone in hand, eyes glued to the screen. His face was unreadable, and for the first time, I saw the kind of tension in his posture that made my stomach twist. He didn't even look up when I entered the room, his attention still fixed on the phone in his hand. I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. I walked over to him, trying to keep my voice steady. "James?" He glanced up briefly, but the look in his eyes wasn't the one I was used to. It wasn't the warmth or care that had once been there. It was something colder, more guarded. "Just finishing up some work," he muttered, not even trying to make it sound convincing. I nodded, but something about his response didn't sit right with me. I glanced at the phone in his hand, and for a brief second, I saw a name flash across the screen. Lauren. It was a name I hadn't heard before. A name that didn't belong in our life. A chill ran down my spine. Who was Lauren? And why was he so desperate to hide her from me? Without thinking, I walked over to the couch and gently reached for his phone. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew I had to know. He jerked back instinctively, his face twisting into a mix of surprise and irritation. "What are you doing?" he snapped. I froze, my heart racing. There was something in his tone that I had never heard before, a sharpness that stung. He quickly pocketed the phone, as if trying to hide it from my sight. The moment stretched out in silence, both of us standing there, unsure of what to say next. "Who's Lauren?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He looked at me, his eyes betraying a brief moment of panic before he masked it with indifference. "Just a coworker. It's nothing, really." But I didn't believe him. I didn't believe a word he said. The way he had reacted, shifting so quickly to hide the phone, the defensiveness in his voice, it all pointed to something more than just a casual colleague. I wanted to press further, to demand the truth, but something stopped me. Maybe I was afraid of what I might uncover. Maybe I already knew deep down that the truth would break me. That night, I lay in bed next to him, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Was I just overreacting? Was I imagining things? Or had James really been hiding something from me all along? One thing was clear. Our marriage, the one I had always believed in, was falling apart in ways I couldn't understand. And I was no longer sure who the stranger lying next to me really was. The days following that evening felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the name on James's phone, Lauren. I replayed that moment over and over in my mind, wondering why he had reacted the way he did. Every time I looked at him, I felt a strange sense of unease, as if we were strangers occupying the same space. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong, but it was impossible. I spent my days distracted, my mind constantly drifting back to the thought of James and Lauren. Who was she really? Why was he hiding her from me? And most importantly, why had he stopped being honest with me? I knew I had to get to the bottom of it. If I didn't, I'd always wonder, and the uncertainty was eating away at me. But I also knew that confronting James would be risky. I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear the truth, whatever it was. Then, one afternoon, I found myself at home alone. I had just come back from running errands, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. I noticed James's car wasn't in the driveway, which meant he was at work. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as if someone was hiding something from me. Without thinking, I walked over to his desk in our study. His laptop was open, sitting there unattended. I hesitated for only a moment before I decided to check it. I knew it wasn't the right thing to do, but I was desperate for answers. I couldn't keep living with this doubt hanging over me. I sat down at the desk and opened the laptop. The screen lit up, and my heart pounded in my chest. I scrolled through the recent messages and documents, my hands trembling. It didn't take long before I found what I was looking for. There, in the email inbox, was a thread of messages between James and Lauren. The first message was innocent enough, about work schedules and deadlines. But as I scrolled further, I saw something that made my blood run cold. "I miss you. I can't stop thinking about you." I froze. My hands went clammy, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but the truth was undeniable. There, in black and white, was proof that James wasn't just hiding something from me, he was in a full-blown affair with Lauren. The messages grew more intimate with each passing exchange. I want you. I can't wait to see you again. And then there were messages about meeting up when I wasn't around. The details were all there, clear as day. My chest tightened as I read through the messages, my world crashing down around me. How long had this been going on? Had I been so blind to the signs? And how could James do this to me, to us? I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw everything in his face. But I didn't. I couldn't. I just sat there, numb, feeling as if I had been slapped awake from a dream I no longer wanted to be a part of. The weight of the betrayal was almost too much to bear. How could the man I loved, the man I had built a life with, be capable of this? How could he deceive me like this right under my nose? I spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, my mind racing with thoughts and questions that had no answers. I felt like I was suffocating. Every corner of the house, every little reminder of our life together, now felt like a lie. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship was shattered, and I was left to pick up the pieces of something that no longer existed. When James finally came home that evening, I didn't know what to say. I couldn't look at him the same way. Every word, every glance from him felt like a lie. He seemed different, too. His usual charm was gone, replaced by a strange tension that hung in the air between us. He asked about my day, but I barely responded, my mind still reeling from the discovery. Then, as I stood in the kitchen, my heart pounding, I couldn't keep it in any longer. Who is Lauren? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He froze. His face drained of color, and for the briefest moment, I saw the panic in his eyes before he quickly regained control. But I wasn't fooled. I knew everything now. It's not what you think, he said, his voice low. I stared at him, my heart breaking all over again. I wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but instead, I asked the only question that seemed to matter now. How long, James? His silence was all the answer I needed. James stood there, frozen, unable to answer. The silence between us was deafening, but it wasn't just the quiet that was suffocating, it was the weight of the truth hanging in the air, thick and undeniable. I had spent so many nights wondering if I was just overthinking things, if my fears were irrational. But now I had all the proof I needed. The words were already out there, the messages already read. His silence confirmed it all. There was no denying what had been happening behind my back. I wanted to collapse, to fall to the ground in the weight of my hurt, but I couldn't. I needed to stay strong, if only for myself. I had spent too long looking for answers, and now, in this moment, I wasn't going to let him avoid the truth any longer. How long, James? I repeated, my voice stronger this time, though it trembled with the remnants of shock and disbelief. He took a deep breath, avoiding my gaze. It was just a few months, he muttered, as if the words themselves were a confession he wasn't ready to make. I felt a cold rush of anger and betrayal. A few months? How long had he been lying to me? How long had I been blind to the truth, while he carried on a secret life right under my nose? A few months? I echoed. And all this time, you thought I wouldn't notice? He shook his head, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I didn't want it to happen. I never meant for it to go this far. I was confused. And then things just... He trailed off, his voice faltering as he searched for an excuse, an explanation that would somehow make his actions seem less unforgivable. But there was no explanation. There was no excuse that could make this right. I felt my chest tighten, the tears threatening to spill, but I held them back. I had spent so many years trusting this man, believing in the love we once shared, and now it felt like everything was crumbling down around me. How could you do this to me, James? I whispered, my voice breaking. I loved you. I trusted you. He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret, but it wasn't enough. Nothing would be enough now. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice soft. It's just... Lauren, she made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. I recoiled, the words cutting through me like a knife. Lauren made him feel something? I had spent years with him, building a life, making memories. And now, he was telling me that another woman made him feel something that I couldn't? Don't say that, I managed, shaking my head. You don't get to blame her. This is on you. You chose this. For a moment, he seemed to shrink in on himself, as if realizing the enormity of what he had done. But then, as if trying to regain control, he stepped toward me, his voice pleading. I never wanted this to end like this, please. I know I've made a terrible mistake, but we can fix this. We can still fix it. We can. Try again. But I couldn't hear him anymore. I couldn't listen to his empty promises, his words that had no weight anymore. The trust was gone, the foundation of our marriage shattered. I stepped back, my heart aching with the realization that no matter how much he wanted to try, I couldn't go back. Not after what I had discovered. Not after everything he had done. No, James, I said, my voice steady but filled with pain. It's too late for that. His face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw the depth of his regret. But it wasn't enough. Regret didn't erase the betrayal. Regret didn't fix the years of lies. Please, just don't leave me, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I stood there, staring at him, my heart breaking for the man I once knew, but for the first time, I realized I wasn't sure who he was anymore. He was a stranger to me, and the man I had loved was gone, replaced by someone who had made choices that tore us apart. I'm leaving, James. I'm done, I said firmly, every word a weight I had been holding in for so long. His eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw the panic rise in them, the fear of losing everything. But it was too late. I had already made up my mind. I turned away, walking out of the room, feeling the finality of my decision settle in my chest. As I walked out of our shared life, I couldn't help but wonder how I had ended up here. How had I missed the signs? How had I been so blind to the man who no longer cared enough to be honest with me? But no matter the answers, I knew one thing for sure. I deserved more than this. I deserved better than a man who had thrown away everything for a fleeting affair. I deserved a chance at happiness, a chance to rebuild my life, without the weight of betrayal holding me back. And as I walked out the door, I realized that this was the beginning of my new life, one that I would build on my own terms, without the shadow of James's lies hanging over me.